May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O God, my rock and my redeemer. When one of my nephews was 2 or 3, he went through a real I do it phase. If you have ever parented or cared for a three-nager, you probably know this phase well. They're beginning to learn about and lean into their own independence, to see what they can do on their own, and to insist that it is slightly more than they truly can. This nephew wanted to tie his own shoes, wash his hands by himself, make his own sandwiches, read his own books. It was really adorable, but also kind of impractical for a toddler who was at like a C+, B- on potty training still. When he tried to do something totally independently, he was never quite satisfied with his work product. He never could get the peanut butter spread the way he wanted to, never could draw what he wanted to draw. It was a little frustrating for the adults, too. If he tried to wash his hands entirely on his own, the bathroom became more of like a SeaWorld attraction than a restroom. The adults around would get frustrated while this toddler tried putting on his own shoes without the manual dexterity required to do anything like it, as he insisted on doing everything all on his own. The right thing to do in that scenario is, of course, not to just sit and watch the kid get frustrated and complain about being late to church, not to add whining to their whining, but it is also not to do all of the work for the kid. You need to develop skills to scaffold the child's development a little bit forward, to help them find the right milestones to meet. This led to scenes that I would describe as something like a toddler-level libertarianism, in which a child who was quite thoroughly supported by the adults around him still felt confidence in his own independence. When it came time to wash hands, someone else would bring a stool up to the counter, turn on the water so it was just the right temperature, bring the soap a little bit closer to him, and then after he was done washing, turn off the water. But because he had pumped the soap and scrubbed his own hands, the toddler confidently got to yell, "I did it," proud of how little he needed anybody else. He thought he was a god in that moment. All of that, both the desire for independence and the adult response to create a more limited and safe context for this independence, represents a developmentally appropriate relationship between a parent or a caregiver and a child. My nephew, I should say, is not the first in my family to desire an amount of early independence. My teachers used to joke that I was born 40, with every year afterwards just kind of like an addition to that 40-year-old birth age, because I was constantly striving to demonstrate that I could handle more than was even expected of me. I was a kid who organized group projects, who treated student government like a global enterprise. I learned later that I was the first freshman class president to request P&L statements of the school accountant. Now, it is good and right for children to have a more limited authority and more limited expectations. If you let children define their own bedtimes every night, I suspect that, at least for many of them, the impulse to think in the short term and not the long term would lead to some tiredness the next day. And in the grander scheme of things, the consequence of this can be much worse than falling asleep in math class. Psychologists in the early days of the family therapy movement described this idea, parentification, where a child is forced to take on adult roles, specifically roles that are not developmentally appropriate for them and often include the care of adults around them, when the responsibility of caregiver and cared for gets flipped in an inappropriate way. Sometimes this comes from emotional neglect, a parent who, because of a substance use disorder or a mental illness, or because they don't quite understand the boundaries between parent and child, ends up treating the child as a peer, an emotional sounding board, a support system. Or maybe the parent has large emotional outbursts that the child needs to manage, both their own emotions in response to and the parent's emotions in a preparatory way to keep themselves safe. Other times, it's about physical neglect, when a child doesn't have their bodily needs met by their parent and needs to meet their own needs, sometimes in addition to those of their parent. Maybe the parent has a disability, or maybe there's a single parent who's not quite able to keep up with the house on their own, or maybe family poverty leads to the kid needing to financially contribute earlier than is appropriate. But regardless of the reason for this early responsibility, and even when it is quite understandable, there are lifelong consequences for the parentified child. These children miss the opportunity for age-appropriate milestones and social development. They, in their adulthood, experience higher rates of worry, anxiety, depression, even physical symptoms like stomach aches. This happens in big ways. These kids, and in their adulthood later, become worried about whether they can hold the whole world together, and in small ways. The kid who is trying to figure out their own bedtime is not prepared for the day ahead. When I talk about the importance of knowing that we are not God, as one of my kind of last postulates to leave with you in this last lecture, I am talking about something sort of like this. I'm talking about the importance of recognizing that God, as our creator, as our eternal parent, has a different role in the world than we do. The first scripture we read is an excerpt from Paul's sermon on Mars Hill. We read the whole thing of that 2 weeks ago when I introduced this sermon series. Paul is hanging out in Greece, and he's noticing the idols around him as he's debating with the philosophers, the Stoics around him. Paul notices that these Greco-Roman gods are many. They are gods who fight with one another, and they are gods who need to be managed by the people. They're gods who are maybe separate from the people who worship them, but are not greater than. Maybe have a greater power, but not a greater kindness, not a greater way to hold the world together. And Paul contrasts this with the God of Israel and subsequently the God of Christianity, who offers a singular force in which we live and move and hold our being, something that holds us all together, that is greater than us and cares for us. Then in our reading from 2 Corinthians, Paul describes a consequence of this, an implication of this. Paul is writing to a community in conflict about lots of things, I imagine. And towards the end of his letter to this church community, he reminds them that it is actually good and okay to have weaknesses and limitations, that they are not expected to be God. Because when we reach our limitations, when we are honest about the fact that we are not all-powerful, when we are honest about the fact that we need to rest, that we need to release some of the load that we carry, when we do all of that, we give God's power the opportunity to take up more space in the room, in our minds, and in our hearts. God's strength becomes visible in the ordinary weakness of our humanity. And when we don't do that, when we try to be the eternal parent, when we try to be God, to hold it all together, we take on a load that is not ours. When we want great power for ourselves, we are signing up, as Uncle Ben from Spider-Man would say, for great responsibility too. A responsibility that is not appropriate for us to carry. A responsibility that can give us unreasonable worry, anxiety, fears that we can't accomplish everything we set out to do, that we cannot make the world right, that we cannot cause a resurrection all on our own. We are looking at God, our eternal parent, and saying, give me that great load that you carry, not realizing how unhealthy it is for us to seek that responsibility. In this sermon series, I'm sharing my reflections on things that I've come to believe, or at least believe are more important than I had before during my time with you. And I talk about this idea that we are not God because I will confess it is something that I have seen this church struggle with. I've seen us worry about burdens that are too great for us to carry. When we ask big questions like who will be our pastor, how will we financially manage this conflict between different departments in the church in the back office? How will we financially survive? When we do that, we are often asking those questions not in a way that looks for what our individual fraction of that responsibility is, but that seeks out how we can solve this great problem all on our own. We do, of course, have a part of the work to do to answer those questions. we have to do the thing where we like pump the soap and scrub our hands. But if we do not honor that there are limits of what we can do, we wind up turning the bathroom into a SeaWorld attraction. We wind up carrying worry that we ought not. We wind up carrying a responsibility that is not ours. When, if we had waited long enough and let the worry sit in the back seat, we would find that we will do quite well financially, that you will find a lovely pastor, that you will fund your missions work, that your church will continue to grow. So, as we part ways from one another and you welcome your next pastor, I offer you this in my last lecture. You are not God. Your pastor is not God. Your church council is not God. We are not God. And so we do not have to carry the whole world in our hands. We don't have the power to do it or the responsibility to do it. We are not God.